Let me tell you about a quiet widow who bought 12 acres of dead limestone on the western edge of the Redland in South Miami-Dade County, Florida, and what I watched her do with it from my side of the hedge over the 7 years that followed. My name is not the part that matters. What matters is that my little fruit tree nursery sat just east of hers, close enough that from my back screen porch I could see the whole western fall of that scrubbed-out grove, and far enough that for a long while I could not make sense of one single thing she was doing in there. The morning she walked the first row of stakes into that ground, I was standing at the back of my packing shed with a cup of black coffee, watching the dawn come up flat and pink over the Everglades. It was the second week of September, 2003, a Tuesday. The kind of soft, humid cool the deep South Florida flatwoods give you just after hurricane season, where the air still holds the salt of the storms that have passed, but the light has already turned warm by 7:30. She was out there on the slow western fall of her land with what looked from 100 yards off like a long iron rod with a wooden crosspiece on top, punching holes into ground that had not grown anything but Brazilian pepper and a little Florida thatch palm since Hurricane Andrew took the old grove down in 1992. That parcel had a name, and the name was not a kind one. Folks called it the rock pad. It was just dead. 12 acres of thin gray sand over a shelf of pale oolitic limestone, the kind the old cracker farmers in this part of Miami-Dade called pinecrest rock, so close to the surface in places you could break your blade plowing it. 2 growers had tried to put avocado back on it after Andrew passed through, and both walked away because the trees would not put down a taproot through the limestone. The man who owned it before had let it go for back taxes after his second failed try, and the county sold it at auction in the last week of August that year for less than the price of a clean used pickup. Nobody bid against the widow. The whole little courthouse room had gone quiet when she raised her paddle. They had let her have it the way a room lets a stranger have a thing nobody wants. Her name, I would come to learn, was Norma Tibbetts. She was 54 years old that fall. Lean and weathered, with deep brown hair gone half to gray pulled back into a low knot at the base of her neck, and a face that had seen 40 summers of South Florida sun without making peace with it. She had spent 30 years as the assistant librarian at the Homestead branch, and she and her late husband had run a small avocado plantation north of Florida City that Hurricane Wilma broke in 2005, and the bank took the year after. Her husband had passed in February of 2007, a slow cancer. She had walked away from all of it with a paid-off pickup, a little life insurance money, her husband's pension, and whatever it is a woman carries inside her that no storm and no bank and no sickness can ever reach. And now she had spent a piece of that money on the one parcel in the whole western Redland that everybody knew for a fact was finished. Decker Sandiford called me that evening. Decker grew papayas on the south side of Chrome Avenue across from her, and he had driven past around 4 in the afternoon while Norma was still out in the heat. He did not say much. He just said he had seen the new lady on the rock pad with a strange iron in her hands, and that he had tried to think of a charitable way to say what he was thinking and decided there wasn't one. I asked him what he was thinking. He was quiet, a long moment. Then he said, "Hazel, that poor woman is going to bury herself on ground that has not come back and never will. Somebody sold her a story." I told him I did not know yet. He said, "Well, I do." And we let it sit there. But I had watched Norma that morning, and there was something in the way she moved that Decker's call could not account for. She had been out there before first light. I know because I am up before first light most days myself. An old habit 46 years of growing tropical fruit puts in your bones. When I came out to the shed at a little past 5:30, her old pickup was already pulled off on the shoulder of the Lime Rock Drive, and I could see the small white cone of a headlamp moving slow across the long western fall of her ground in the gray dark. Not searching, not wandering, moving in a steady line from one end of a contour to the other, then stepping up maybe 20 inches and beginning again, like she had already laid the whole face of that grove out in her head before she ever set boot on it. She worked through the morning and into the heat of the day. By 11, the temperature was climbing into the upper 80s, which is what South Florida does to you straight through October. Wet warm at dawn and hot wet by lunch. She did not stop. She had a gallon water jug staged in the bed of the truck, and she came down to it maybe once an hour, drank standing up, and went back. She did not eat that I saw. She did not sit down. She drove a hole, dropped something into it from a canvas tote at her hip, pressed the soil back with the heel of her boot, and moved on. A few feet, another hole. A few feet, another hole. I watched her a long while before I went on with my rounds, and I could not place what bothered me about it. At 71 years old, I have watched a lot of folks work a lot of bad ground in this corner of the state, and you learn to tell the difference between a person trying a thing and a person executing one. Norma was executing. She worked until the light went long and gold around 6:30 in the evening. Then she covered her totes with a tarp weighted down with chunks of limestone and drove away. I stood at the corner of my windbreak with the last of my coffee gone cold and looked at her ground. From the drive, you could see nothing she had done. But that is not what this story is about. That is only what the land looked like from the drive, from Decker Sandiford's truck, from any place a person did not trouble themselves to look closely. What I had watched that day was a quiet woman doing a thing on purpose, with the kind of unhurried certainty you do not come by without paying for it first. A brief note for the viewer: the tool Norma was using that morning is called a dibble bar. An iron rod about 3 feet long with a pointed tip and a T-handle used to punch clean planting holes in hard or rocky ground without disturbing the soil around them. It is one of the oldest planting tools still in everyday use in American agriculture, going back to the early 1800s, and its design has barely changed because it solves a problem nothing else solves as well. On thin, rocky ground like the limestone of South Florida, it remains the most effective planting tool a person can carry by hand. Part 2. Now, here is the part of it that the Western Redland got wrong, and got wrong loudly. About 5 days into her planting, I had a reason to walk down to the south fence line we shared. A length of welded wire had slumped where a sea grape had pushed against it through the summer, and I had meant to pull it tight before the next squall came through. I took my fencing pliers and a coil of baling wire and walked the quarter-mile down through the lime grove. I want to be clear that I did not go down to introduce myself, but the fence needed working, and it ran right past where she was planting. She heard me coming a good 30 feet off. She straightened up from the row she was working and looked at me without any surprise at all, the way a person looks at a thing they have already accounted for. I said good morning. She said it back. Her voice was lower than I expected, and steady, with a faint flatness to the vowels. Some old Florida cracker in her mother's people, that 30 years of school library quiet had not quite worn out. I told her I was her neighbor on the bench to the east. She said she knew. I nodded at the holes she was punching, and I asked her, plain as I could, what she was planting. She said vanilla. I did not at that moment know what to do with that. I knew vanilla the way every woman who has baked a cake knows it. The dark sweet stuff in a brown bottle from the grocery store. I knew it came from a bean, and I had a vague idea the bean came from somewhere far off. I told her I had never heard of a person planting it on purpose in Florida, that the whole world's vanilla came in on freighters from Madagascar, and that not a single grower in Miami-Dade had ever tried it commercial. She nodded, slow, the way you nod at a person who has said something polite and expected. Then she asked me a question I have not forgotten. She asked me what I thought the limiting factor would be on that ground for vanilla in this country. I thought about it. I said the heat, probably, and the lack of decent soil, and the sun would scald the leaves, and the wind off the glades would tear it up. She shook her head just barely. She said the heat was the asset. The wind was the asset. The thin limestone was the asset. She said vanilla did not want deep black soil. Deep soil would rot its roots and kill the vine. It wanted exactly what that grove pad was. Thin alkaline limestone, broken stone, the same kind of ground it grew on for 10,000 years in the rainforest limestone country of southeastern Mexico, where the orchid is native and where the Totonac people had cultivated it for centuries before any European ever saw a bean. She said vanilla was an orchid that climbed. It needed support and broken shade, not open sun, which was why she had bought a parcel that still held the dead and dying mango and avocado trunks Hurricane Andrew had left standing. Those trunks were not debris to her. They were trellises. She said the thing everybody saw as wrong with that hillside was the very thing that made it perfect. Every other person in the western Redland had looked at the rock pad and seen what would not grow there. She had come looking for ground that would grow the one thing she was after, and there was not a better 12 acres for it in 3 counties. I picked up my pliers. We talked a few minutes more about the corner post, which she offered to reset herself, and which she did the next week, better than I would have. And I walked back up to my place with a feeling I did not have a word for yet. I told you there is a difference between a person trying a thing and a person finishing one. Standing at that fence, I understood I had been wrong even about that. Norma was not trying to figure out that grove. She had figured it out somewhere else, long before she ever raised her paddle at the auction. What I was watching was not a question being asked. It was an answer being completed. Glenis Parmenter came up my drive that same afternoon. Glenis ran a little goat dairy 3 miles south, and she had borrowed my dolly cart the month before and was bringing it back, along with a jar of mango chutney she had put up. She stood on my porch with the cart handle in one hand and the jar in the other, and she looked west toward the rock pad where Norma was now working the 6th or 7th row. She said, "Hazel, what in the world is that lady doing in there?" I told her, "Planting vanilla." She looked at me. She said, "Vanilla?" I said, "Yes." She said, "On the rock pad?" I said, "Yes." She stood there a long minute. Then she said the thing the whole community was already saying in private, that somebody had taken advantage of a broken-down widow who didn't know any better, that the rock pad had whipped every grower who ever touched it, and would whip this one too, that you could no more farm that grove than you could farm the bed of the Tamiami Canal. She did not say it with meanness. She said it the way women in this country say a hard thing when they think it needs saying out loud. And I did not argue, because the history of that parcel was every bit as bad as Glenis said. But I had stood 30 feet from Norma Tibbetts at the fence, and I had heard her say the word vanilla the way a woman says the name of something she has known and studied for a very long time. I watched the grove a while longer after Glenis drove off. Norma had moved to the next row, bending, driving, dropping, pressing, moving on. And then she stopped and pulled something out of the pocket of her work shirt and stood up straight a moment to look at it. And I saw that it was a small notebook, a plain composition book, the black and white marbled kind they sell at the dollar store for $2. But the way she handled it told me it was not new. She opened it to one particular page without hunting for it, read something, closed it, and put it back. She did not write anything down. She was checking the grove against work she had already done somewhere else, in some other season, before she had ever turned the first chunk of limestone on that ground. That notebook bothered me more than I let on. The way a thing bothers you when you half recognize it but cannot place it. Whatever was guiding Norma Tibbetts across that dead grove, she had not thought of it that year. She was finishing work already finished in her head, written down in a hand I would later learn was not even her own. And that, I came to understand, made all the difference in the world. A brief note for the viewer. Vanilla planifolia is not a vine in the ordinary sense, but a climbing orchid, native to the limestone forests of southern Mexico and parts of Central America. The cured bean carries hundreds of distinct aromatic compounds, with vanillin only the most prominent. Almost all of the world's commercial vanilla is now grown in Madagascar, Indonesia, and Uganda. The plant requires support, broken shade, and well-drained alkaline soil, and it must be hand-pollinated bean by bean, which is why true vanilla remains by weight one of the most expensive agricultural commodities on Earth. Part 3. Now, here is the part of the story I want you to stay with, because this is where I learned what Norma Tibbetts had really been doing, and where I understood that what looked from Chrome Avenue like one widow's foolishness was in truth the most carefully reasoned piece of work I ever saw done on a parcel of South Florida ground. It was about 10 days after she finished her planting, the last week of September. I had walked down to the south fence one evening with 2 jars of guava jelly my granddaughter had sent me from plantation, more than I could use. Norma was sitting on the tailgate of her pickup at the foot of the grove, drinking water from a mason jar. I held up the jars over the fence. She came over. We talked a minute, and then she asked me if I wanted to come up to the house and see something. I said I would. Her house was a small block and stucco place, a quarter-mile west of the grove. 3 rooms, low flat roof. The kind of place that had been somebody's caretaker quarters in 1955 and had sat empty 8 years before she bought it with the land. She had put a new metal roof on it herself that summer. We sat on the front porch in 2 old wooden chairs facing east toward the dawn line over the Everglades. The light was going that deep gold the glades give you in late September. She set a notebook on the small table between us, not the composition book from her shirt pocket. A leather-cornered field ledger, cracked and soft with age. The kind of book that has been carried in a satchel for years. She opened it slow. The pages were old, a heavy linen paper gone brown at the edges, and everyone was crowded with a fine slanted hand that was not her own. Dates in the margins, columns of figures, soil readings in pH and parts per million, little pencil drawings of orchid roots, and the way they wrap around a hose trunk. Tucked into the inside cover were photocopies gone slightly waxy with old toner. She laid one flat for me to look at. It was a single page of a bulletin from 1958. The header read, University of Miami Subtropical Experiment Station, Homestead, Florida. The bulletin was about the cultivation of vanilla planifolia on marginal oolitic limestone soils. The author was a man named Warren Elstrom. Norma said the name out loud, slow, the way you say a name you have been thinking about for years. Elstrom had been a horticulturist at the experiment station from 1942 until he retired in 1971. A man who spent his career driving the lime rock back roads of South Florida in an old state station wagon with a soil auger in the back, stopping wherever he saw a parcel of ground that other people had given up on. Elstrom had spent years studying the wild orchids of the South Florida hammocks, comparing them with the cultivated vanilla stands he had visited as a young man in Veracruz. He had wanted to know if the orchid the Totonac people had grown for 1,000 years on Mexican limestone could be grown by Florida farmers on the same rock that lay 6 inches under their boots. He had written it all down in a string of bulletins almost nobody ever read. Norma had found a stack of them, 14 in all, in a metal cabinet at the back of the Homestead Library Archive in the spring of 2001, when the branch was being renovated. She was the assistant librarian then. She had spent 2 long Saturday afternoons sitting on the storage room floor reading them, and had taken the whole stack home in a banker's box that night. The 1958 bulletin was the one that mattered. What Elstrom had found, working a wild stand of orchids in a hardwood hammock not 4 miles from where Norma's house now stood, was that South Florida oolitic limestone. The exact kind of ground every grower in the Redland wrote off as dead, supported vanilla planifolia better than any rich black muck soil ever could. The lime fed the orchid. The thin substrate forced the roots to wrap and climb the way they were built to. The broken shade of a wind-damaged grove, with old trunks still standing, gave the vines exactly the dappled light and rough bark they needed. The summer rains and the winter dry season matched, almost month for month, the rainfall pattern of the Mexican home country. Elstrom had written that with nothing more than patience and a planting bar, a person could establish a stand of high-quality vanilla on storm-broken Florida limestone, that the citrus and avocado outfits considered finished, and harvest cured beans in 7 to 9 years that would carry a vanillin concentration to rival the best Mexican stock. He had written that in 1958. He had died in 1979. In all the years between, not one soul in Florida had ever acted on that bulletin. The reason, Elstrom had written in a letter clipped to the back, was simple. In 1958, synthetic vanillin from the wood pulp industry was already cheaper than the best beans on the market. Nobody had the patience for a 7-year crop undercut by a chemical plant in New Jersey. Norma had sat with the bulletin, she told me, for 2 full winters before she planted a single orchid. The first winter she had used it to understand what she was looking at, walking the wild hammocks of the southern glades, measuring, testing soil samples in jars on her kitchen table, comparing her own numbers against Elstrom's across 40 years. Everything matched. The second winter she had stopped testing. She had been waiting until she was sure the conclusion was the right one, and not just the one she wanted because she had nothing else left. I told her my own father had done a thing like that once. Walked a piece of pasture on our place in the Kissimmee country 3 years before he set a single fence post on it. The neighbors all thought he was waiting on money. He wasn't. He was waiting on certainty, which is a different thing and costs more. Norma nodded the way you nod when a person says something plain and true. I asked her one more thing that evening. I asked her how she could have been so sure that what she found on the grove would match what a dead man had written more than 40 years before. And she said a thing I have turned over many nights since. She said she had not been sure. She said you cannot be sure of a thing like that. What you can be is prepared to be wrong about it in a small enough way that you can recover. 600 orchid cuttings, she said, was the size of a mistake she could afford. If the grove was not what she believed it to be, she would lose 3 years in the cost of the cuttings and walk away knowing more about that ground than any living person in 3 counties. That was the deal she had made with herself, alone in that blockhouse with the wind coming through the screen door. And it was the deal she honored the morning she drove the first stake. A brief note for the viewer. The field agronomists and horticulturists of the mid-20th century left behind a great body of careful handwritten knowledge. Local soil studies, plant trials, growing notes, much of it published only in short mimeographed bulletins mailed out by state experiment stations and rarely archived. These men often retired or died before any farmer acted on their findings. A significant part of that knowledge survives today only in unbound copies scattered through county libraries and old farm offices, and much of it has never been digitized. Part 4. The orchids did almost nothing for the first 2 years, the way Norma had told me to expect. From my fence line, the grove looked the same as ever, the dead trunks gray against the broken sky. The young vines so low and pale green against the rough bark that you could not see them at all from the road. The community mostly forgot about her. Decker Sandiford still shook his head when he drove past on Chrome Avenue. But Norma walked that grove every week in the cool of the morning, checking, weeding by hand, training the leading shoots gently against the old trunks with strips of cotton cloth she had cut from her late husband's worn-out work shirts. She replaced the few cuttings that had not taken. She wrote in her composition book in her own small, even hand. By the 3rd year, you could see them. By the 4th, the dead grove that had grown nothing in living memory was alive with row on row of dark green orchid vines climbing the bare trunks like ribbons on a maypole. I stood at my fence and looked at it a long time. Glenis came over one afternoon and said, "Hazel, that lady is not the woman I thought she was." I told her none of us had been. But vanilla does not pay in the 4th year. Vanilla makes you wait, and Norma waited. She had planted for the long bean, the cured, slow-fermented pod, and that would not be ready until the 7th year. She spent those years carefully. She thinned and tended. She let the strongest vines throw their side shoots, and rooted those cuttings out across new ground under the same broken canopy, so the original 600 slowly became 1,200, then closer to 15. In the 5th year, the first flowers came, and Norma walked the grove every morning at sunrise with a slender bamboo splint, hand-pollinating one blossom at a time, the way the Totonac women had done for centuries, because the only bee in the world that pollinates vanilla naturally does not live in Florida. She kept her notebooks. She kept the leather ledger on the kitchen table where she could reach it. It was in the 7th year that the thing turned, and it turned the way these things do, slow, and then all at once. Norma harvested her first mature beans that spring. She cut the long green pods by hand at the moment Elstrom had specified, when the tip just begins to yellow, and cured them on cypress racks on her back porch the slow Mexican way, killing them in hot water, sweating them under blankets, drying in the sun by day and resting by night for 4 full months. She split one open at the end of curing to see what 7 years had built. The bean was dark as wet leather, and soft and oily, and the scent that came up off it filled the room and drifted out into the dooryard where I could smell it standing at the fence. It was not the thin smell of the brown bottle. It was something deeper and rounder, with notes of dried fig and wood smoke under the sweet. She sent a small bundle of beans and a written record of her soil and her methods to a culinary lab up in Gainesville, because she wanted to know what she had. The woman from the lab called her on the telephone before the written report ever reached the mailbox. The vanillin content of Norma's beans, grown on that storm-broken limestone grove, was among the highest the lab had ever measured from a domestic American sample. Higher, the woman said, than most of what came in on the freighters from Madagascar. She asked Norma where they had been grown. Norma told her, a grove pad outside Homestead the citrus people wouldn't touch. She asked if it could be done again. Norma said it could. The first one to drive out was a young chef who ran a small farm-to-table place in Coconut Grove down in Miami. He had heard about Norma's beans from the lab. He drove the 45 minutes south and stood on Norma's porch and split a cured bean with his own paring knife, and breathed in slow, and stood a long moment without saying a word. What he said when he finally spoke was not how much does it cost. It was how many can I have. Then came a pastry chef who drove down from Sarasota. Then 2 more from Orlando. Then a chef from a small restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, who had read about Norma's beans in a regional food magazine and drove 12 hours to see the grove. They drove hours, All of them. Past 1,000 bad parcels to buy off the one grove every grower in the western Redland had sworn was finished. Norma did not raise her prices. She did not expand past what one woman could tend and pollinate and cure with care. She sold her beans to a short list of small restaurants in 4 states, and the waiting list ran longer every season, and she never once put a sign out on Chrome Avenue. The folks who had laughed at the courthouse auction did not laugh anymore. Some of them came around hat in hand to ask how she had done it. And Norma told them every time, plainly, because the telling was part of the work too. She told them about Warren Elstrom and the metal cabinet at the back of the library archive and the dead man's bulletin nobody in the state had ever acted on. She never once let a person believe she had done it alone. She is older now. The dark brown has gone almost fully to gray. She still walks the grove in the cool of the morning. She still uses the same dibble bar she started with, the iron worn smooth by her hands. She has had the brittle pages of Elstrom's ledger copied and bound, and keeps the original in a wooden box on her kitchen table. And on the kitchen windowsill above her sink, where the late afternoon sun comes through, there is a single glass jar. It is small, no bigger than a baby food jar, and it is half full of pale dry crumbs of pinecrest limestone, scraped off the rock pad the first week she owned the land, before she drove a single hole. On the front, in her own hand, in black marker, is a small label. It reads, Pinecrest Rock, Miami-Dade County, Florida, September 2003. She showed it to me once. I asked her why a woman would keep a jar of the very dirt everybody had told her was dead. She turned it in the light a while. Then she said the rock was never the enemy. The rock was the whole reason. It was the poor dry limestone that grew the deepest beans. And it was that same poor rock that scared every other person off the parcel and left it cheap enough for a widow to buy. Everybody looked at this land, she said, and saw what wouldn't grow. One dead man looked at the same land and saw what would. She set the jar back on the sill. The land doesn't owe you a crop. It owes you the truth of what was always there, if you're willing to wait and pay enough to see it. A brief note for the viewer. The cultivation of vanilla orchids has begun in recent years to take quiet root in the warm subtropical pockets of the American South, particularly in southern Miami-Dade County and parts of the Florida Keys. Growers have found that the region's broken hurricane-damaged limestone hammocks, long considered worthless for conventional farming, can produce cured beans of unusually high vanillin content, well suited to small batch culinary use. The model favors patient, small-scale operations on marginal land and has drawn interest from second career growers and restaurants across the South.